Welcome, Frauke, to our podcast. Yeah, I would like to welcome you again. You have been here on our podcast for already several times, no? And you are also a former student of our master's program. And as you already told us, you are currently working for Skyborn Renewables. It's a project developer for offshore wind projects. And we are really happy to hear from you and to hear about your experiences in this field of work. Maybe you can start to tell us a bit about what you do currently and maybe a bit of your track records on maybe offshore wind projects that you have worked with.
Yes, thanks, Johannes. I'm glad to be here again. So what I'm currently working on is software implementation. So it's a bit further away from the offshore wind farm projects that I used to work for. So in the projects I worked for the turbine package. And that was the last project I worked in was the Taiwanese project called Yunlin. And before that, I worked for a Belgian company called Falkwind for a German wind farm called Arcades Ost 1. That one is also operational, I think, for over a year now. But okay, in the end, it wasn't part of the company anymore. But now I'm still happy to see that it succeeded and that it actually worked out. And I think that part of the layout is still the same as I invented and optimized
Good to hear
while
that.
I was working there. I hope they're producing well. I don't know.
And I think it must be nice to see how your own project then turned out, and you can see how you're working and how your work then played out in these projects. Yeah.
Yeah, it's nice to see that it becomes reality at some point. So everything that you planned on paper on the laptop and discussed, and in the end to see that it succeeds, it's really cool.
If we kind of dive right deep into our topic here, which is also the permitting part of offshore wind farms and in general the European wind industry, we are very interested in the current status. So because the development of offshore wind farms is accelerating a lot right now in Europe, in all of Europe. But how would you see, or what would you say are the current limiting factors in the development of the European offshore wind energy, or maybe what are the bottlenecks that we can see currently?
One of the classical bottlenecks is the supply chain. So it's nice if a lot of countries want offshore wind power, especially in Europe, but then you also need to have the material and the companies providing all the components to build an offshore wind farm. And that takes a lot of time to manufacture, it takes a lot of materials. And the past years there have been, due to the war in Europe and so on, and before that COVID, there have been a lot of hiccups in the supply chain. So I think it's still not completely recovered from that. Then a bottleneck is also installation spreads, so vessels then can install the offshore wind farms. That's those vessels are booked for years in advance, so you cannot be very spontaneous about building an offshore wind farm. And that makes it also difficult to plan because you don't have a high availability of installation spreads. That's I think a challenge. Then it can be a challenge also to have skilled people, to have enough technicians who can work building those wind farms. That's a classic.
So it's like these are challenges that a lot of industries are facing currently.
Yes,
you could say. Yeah, and can you kind of see differences in how countries support the planning or the permitting process of new offshore wind farms? Or maybe can you see that they have different priorities? Yeah, not only in Europe, I mean like worldwide. I mean, you mentioned that you worked for an offshore wind project in Taiwan. Maybe they have different priorities there.
Yes, so definitely offshore wind power relies a lot on local policies, how much they support offshore wind power, how much they want it, and how they want to give you the right to build an offshore wind farm. So do they use an auction scheme, or is it something like areas awarded to individual developers based on, I don't know, other criteria? Do they pay a feed-in tariff, or is it like free market? You just suggest a price and there you go. You have different ways to compensate developers for the electricity. So feed-in tariff would be something which is like how you could start the industry. But now in Europe, you don't have that anymore because the industry is more mature. So you go for the CFDs, the contract for difference, or actually there's no state support at all anymore. And you go for non-subsidized offshore wind farms. And then, in order to still have them profitable, then you need to, as a developer, sell your own electricity somehow. So there needs to be a good demand and a constant demand for electricity. Then you go for those power purchase agreements to make sure that all these years you operate them, you actually can also sell your electricity for a good price. And in general, to make your projects profitable, it's always good to have as little risk as possible, which makes the financing cheaper. So the way you finance your project will become cheaper. And there are some mechanisms that countries can support that. For example, by being very specific about the areas that they offer in an auction, they can already do some surveys and then provide you the results. So you have less risk in, I don't know, the soil conditions, how it's going to look like, which type of foundation you can build, and so on. You don't need to make that many assumptions. You can already base it on data that they provide to you. So you don't need to pay a big survey campaign to find out, okay, the soil is actually not as good as we thought it would be. But you have this data up front. That helps de-risking the projects, and that makes them also more profitable. And of course, the dream of every developer would be to have an auction where you get all the survey data for free, and then also a feed-in tariff. But that's not that's not gonna happen. Not anymore. But so that's also on the local legislation or regulations to de-risk the projects. It also depends what are the requirements for localization, for example. How mature is the industry in that specific country you're gonna build an offshore wind farm? Is this a completely new part of the world where there's no offshore wind farm at all yet? Then you still need to build up a lot of infrastructure. If you already have super mature harbors and industries like you have in Europe, then you can rely on that. That also de-risks your project. You don't need to invest a lot to make them ready to build offshore wind farms.
Yeah, makes sense. And maybe connected to this topic, how can we think about it if you as a project developer, how would you approach like a new offshore market or a market in a new country where you have no experience yet? And could you maybe then apply a lot of the experience that you already gained in European projects? Could you then apply these experiences also to, for example, the American or the Asian market?
I mean, for sure, it's good to have experience from, even if it's from another part of the world, but you also need to be cautious about your experience, that you don't overestimate how much of the experience you can directly apply to a region that you haven't worked in before. Then I think it's good to have local context, to have reliable sources locally about the conditions in that area where you're starting something new, so that you don't think you can just come from the outside and it's super obvious how it's working in that country. Maybe it's not that obvious in the end, and you will have a lot of challenges because you didn't consider certain things just because you don't know that much about the country. Then I guess it's a good idea to look for local partners as well, so you don't have to do it all by yourself. Maybe you can team up with a party that's already a bit more experienced in that area or a bit more local. And just don't go for a completely not knowing about anything and trying to build it the same way you did it before somewhere else. That can be quite challenging.
And then if you found your market, or maybe your new projects, and then like company internal for the company, the structures that you apply during these development processes. Can you then have the same structures internally to develop these projects that you would use here for European projects, or do you need to adjust them specifically to each country?
Yeah, so there are some parts where you can try to standardize, or we do standardize them so that we follow the same procedures internally, and also it's easier for people to work in different projects because you do it kind of like the same way and the same style, and they're the same criteria to like decide, do we want to continue with the project or not. So that's one of the big efforts to standardize the way we do projects. But yeah, you cannot standardize everything because of these things, like how the permit works, how the stakeholder communication, the local communication works, what the specific requirements are for the country. They can be very different. Also, environmental impact assessments can be different on like what you need to focus, what's more important, what's less important, for getting the permit that you have a look at before you build the offshore wind farm. So yeah, it will always be a mix of both, and that's why you need also people who are locals to educate you in what can you do here, what can you not do here, how do you behave here, because then after all, if it's like a very different area from where you come from, it's like you're a guest, so you need to find out how you behave in that area where you're not that knowledgeable yet. And so that will always be a very local approach and something tailored to that specific project. Also, there are different ways to how to get a permit. The auction schemes are different. The deadlines for that are different. The way you hand in a bid and what you need to deliver together with the bid is different. So that cannot be standardized because that's very country specific.
Yeah, it's very interesting to hear that and the insights from your project development perspective. And I would like to thank you for having this podcast with us today. And then we will see you probably next year. Thank you.
Yes. Thanks a lot for having me, and see you next week.